All right, well, I'm going to get started here. Welcome, everyone, to Balancing Excitement and Caution in the Public Eye, Psychedelics in the Media. We have two very bright minds to share with us their thoughts on how psychedelics are being reported in the media today. So I'm going to start with Manoj Dose. Manoj is a cognitive neuropsychopharmacologist, broadly interested in the acute and enduring effects of psychoactive drugs on brain function, cognition, and emotion, with focuses on hallucinogens and episodic memory. Manoj received his PhD from the University of Chicago, working with David Gallo and Harriet DeWitt on the impact of psychoactive drugs on emotional episodic memory and memory distortion. Currently, he is a postdoctoral scholar at the Center for Psychedelic and Consciousness Research, where he utilizes complex cognitive paradigms, brain imaging, and computational modeling to explore what makes 5-HT2A psychedelics unique compared to other classes of psychoactive drugs. Although he's optimistic that psychedelics will soon have a place in psychiatry, he remains cautious of exaggerated benefits and negligence to potential harms. Also joining us is Shayla Love, an award-winning science journalist based in Brooklyn, New York. She has a master's degree from Columbia University in Science, Environment, and Medicine Journalism, and her writing has appeared in Vice, The Washington Post, Mosaic, The Boston Globe, and other publications. She writes about many topics within science and health, including psychology, neuroscience, psychedelics, sociology, linguistics, and the intersection of history, culture, and philosophy with present-day research. Welcome all. So this is a topic I have reported on, but not quite as much as Shayla. And when I have, everyone always tells me, like the amount of stuff, the buzz around psychedelics is insane. And I've spoken with a number of scientists who say, I've never seen this much excitement around an industry in my entire career. So Shayla and Manoj, I'm going to ask you guys, how would you compare the excitement around psychedelics compared to other purported medical breakthroughs that you guys have seen reported in the media in your careers?
I can start. I think it's definitely true that there's a lot of buzz around psychedelics, and now in the mainstream media, there's tons of articles all the time after every new study comes out. But I don't think it's that novel or unique in terms of being covered in ways that make it seem like a breakthrough or a cure or a quick fix. There was a psychologist, Scott O. Lilienfeld, who I liked a lot, and he came up with this term called breakthroughism, which is this idea that whenever something new and exciting comes out, we all get excited about it, and we call it a breakthrough, but these things often peter out. So I've written about mental health for a long time before I covered psychedelics, and I saw this all the time for things like transcranial magnetic stimulation or different forms of therapy, CBT, hypnosis therapy, supplements. Like you really don't have to go very far within health to find this, hype or buzz or breakthroughsm, as Scott called it. And so I think that's actually a good thing, because it means that there are lessons that we can learn from the ways that other kinds of health interventions have been covered when it comes to psychedelics.
Yeah, so Shayla kind of touches on some of the things that I've worked on. So as a cognitive neuroscientist, I use brain imaging methods. Other people, my colleagues, use things like TMS. And, TMS, for example, or even the fMRI, actually, let's just go to fMRI. It's something that I use, and it's been around for about 30 years. It measures blood flow, which is a correlate of brain activity. And people really thought that this was going to be okay. Once we have this information, we'll be able to use it and advance psychiatry, neurology, et cetera. fMRI is still not used really medically. It's pretty much not used at all medically, and it's definitely not used in psychiatry. We're not using it in any way for diagnosis, prognosis. There's really no purpose for it at this point. So anytime you see pretty images, with fMRI and looking at the brain, they a lot of times aren't very meaningful in a practical sense. And so, yeah, I think that a lot of people think that the hype is maybe bigger right now with psychedelics than many other places. And perhaps that's sort of true amongst the public, because, a lot of people have done the drugs and they, felt like, yeah, this would be a breakthrough. But at least as from like a neuroscience background, there's a lot of breakthroughs that come around, and they don't usually push the needle too much further. Another example I could give is reconsolidation. Memory reconsolidation is the whole idea that when you reactivate a memory, it can undergo a state that's labile, and then you can disrupt it in some way. So in animals, it worked really well, and you could kind of delete a fear memory, at least in rodents, but it hasn't really worked super well in humans, or else, we would have cured PTSD by now. So I think that, and that was a really big thing. It was a Nature paper, et cetera. So yeah, I think that there is hype in various other fields, but it might feel a little bit bigger because the public is more involved now with something like psychedelics, because loads of people have done the drugs now.
Yeah, that's a good point, that the hype might feel bigger because people have had access to these drugs. Whereas when fMRI, I remember the way the media used to write about fMRI as if it was going to be this huge thing, and they could just scan your brain and they could tell you that you have depression and what depression drug to take, and then you'll be cured, et cetera. But people don't have access to fMRI. So even though there could have been hype about this breakthrough, it wasn't something they could go out and have access to. They would have to, go into a hospital. Not everybody has a fMRI machine laying around. So that is a piece of it that is a little different than other forms of like mental health breakthroughs in the past.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, because it's also something that the public can wrap their heads around, right? Like a lot of the science that you guys deal with is extremely complex stuff, whereas when you hear something like, psychedelics and mental health, there's just a general easier narrative for the consumer to follow. This kind of dovetails into my next question, where I'm asking you guys to sort of rate your excitement versus your skepticism. And I'm curious if you could also just touch upon how you've seen psychedelics presented. Like Shayla, you had mentioned, some things being presented as a quick fix. Is that the kind of message you've seen, or like what kind of caution are you seeing attached to promoting or marketing, the various research that's being done?
Yeah, so I will say that I have seen a spectrum of coverage about psychedelics that range from, kind of shallow, speculative, really excited, to then also like really cautionary. And I think it's good that we have this spectrum. Within the spectrum though, right, whenever like coverage is a bit too extreme, then we start to worry about the harm it might be doing for the people that are reading it, right? So I always think about readers. The people who care about learning about psychedelics from news articles are people who may be interested in those treatments themselves. And so if they read something that's kind of simplistic and overly positive and uses only positive anecdotes, they may just sort of translate that person's experience directly onto them and assume that will happen to them, or vice versa. And so for me, it's really about the reader coming away with a good understanding of how preliminary a lot of the research is, and like understanding the sample sizes, and being hopeful and optimistic, and maybe being interested in the basic science and the cool brain stuff that people are doing, but not so immediately making a one-to-one direct translation to their own life. And so if then I could pick on the scale from 1 to 5, I think it kind of depends, like, are we excited about the potential promise and about a really cool body of research? Then like I'm a 5 on that scale. Am I excited about like the definite translatability to every single condition that psychedelics are being researched for right now? Like I maybe a 2.5, I don't know, we'll see. My scale moves depending on what the question is. But I think that when it comes to kind of shorter articles about psychedelic clinical trial results, I have felt that there is a need to just be like a little more cautious in terms of presenting those findings to people, not because it's not exciting, but just because it's a lot for somebody who's maybe had depression their whole life to read that this could be a cure. We just don't want to promise that unnecessarily.
Yeah, so I think I'm in the same place as Shayla. So I mean, I guess if I were between those numbers, that would be a 3.75. But I think, yeah, I mean, I'm excited I'm excited, forget psychedelics. I'm excited that we're kind of getting rid of this puritanical, it's almost as if like the way it turns out, cannabis is still not really all that great for a lot of medical conditions. We already have THC legal for, nausea if you have AIDS or cancer. And it was kind of a Trojan horse, right? That it kind of snuck in and, saying that it was medical. And now we've got legal cannabis in several states, and hopefully in our lifetime. I think psychedelics are going to be a little bit of a Trojan horse here. And I think this is something I'm for. Obviously, I don't speak on behalf of Hopkins or any of my puritanical peers, but I'm pretty pro, legalizing, decriminalizing drugs. And I think this is starting to lean in that direction. We're already seeing now in Oregon, I think they decriminalized all drugs. So I am excited about that. I'm also excited for the potential for treating some disorders. Again, just like Shayla said, I don't think it's going to treat absolutely every disorder. I don't think they're going to replace SSRIs. I don't know if they'll become the first kind of line treatment. At least not, I don't know. I mean, I say that, but maybe they will, who knows? But yeah, I don't think they're going to be used for absolutely everything. So yeah, I think again, as Shayla said, I'd probably be around a 2.5 there. I think probably for depression, they'll probably work for a lot of people. So I think I think that hopefully answered that question in terms of the hype. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And guys, sorry, I forgot to mention, in terms of anyone wanting to throw in questions, just throw them in the chat if anything comes to mind, and I will work it into our conversation here. And Manoj, you had mentioned like the marketing of cannabis, and I'm curious if there's any examples that come to mind for something you saw and we're just like, okay, whoa, that claim is concerning and can actually cause harm. And you don't necessarily have to come up with it right now, but just wondering if there's anything that comes to mind for you that you've seen that you would point to and say, okay, this is not good, this is not right.
I'm trying to think of, something specific with psychedelics that I think people have been generally, I don't know, Symposia can probably give a lot more examples of when people have been particularly out of line, although sometimes I think Symposia might go a little like read too deep into what some people say. But I mean, I think, for example, with things like ayahuasca, I think people need to not forget that there is a monoamine oxidase inhibitor in there that can be dangerous if you, take an SSRI or an SNRI, NDR, any antidepressant, or if you've eaten too much cheese with tyramine in it. So it's like we kind of, I've sometimes seen ayahuasca just marketed way too willy-nilly, and that might be one case that I can think of. I mean, again, I think we do have to worry about the potential. This is why, I was going to maybe say this, that the reason why I don't know if they'll end up being first-line treatments is because the risk of psychosis, of triggering that, is it's not zero. And a lot of times when you do trigger something like psychosis, some people do recover. I mean, I was just watching this video of this guy who, I don't think it was triggered by drugs, but he went into a zoo, into like a lion's cage, and like tried to convince the lions something about Jesus or something like that. He literally tried to convert these lions, and because he was having a psychotic break. And then it turned out later on, the guy was able to lucidly talk about this experience. He didn't die. He didn't get killed by the lions. He was able to lucidly talk. So some people can recover, but I also have a friend who, for example, they're never probably going to be off antipsychotics for the rest of their life after taking psilocybin. So I think that there is that, when people say it's like, oh yeah, these things are going to replace SSRIs, blah, blah, blah. That's a little bit, being too hopeful and forgetting that there is this potential risk with potentially irreversible psychosis, right? Whereas, taking an SSRI, for a month, there are some things that can happen, weight gain, depending on the SSRI, you can't drink alcohol as much. There are some potentially permanent effects. I've read, like, for example, like people having sexual dysfunction that's not going away. But I think that those are quite rare. So I mean, I think this optimism that we're going to replace, current meds is maybe a little bit of a dangerous line of thought, but I don't know. I mean, I think most people probably also can do psychedelics and not end up, getting psychosis, but I don't know. No.
Shayla, anything you'd want to add in terms of anything you've seen that really raised eyebrows for you?
I mean, I've seen this a couple places. I have seen it specifically in marketing material as well. It's phrased something like X years of therapy in X a period of time, where like the second period of time is really small. So it's like 10 years of therapy in 2 months, and then they get more extreme. 100 years of therapy in 2 weeks, like the numbers on either end in the phrasing get very extreme. And I really don't like that, because I'm not even sure what that means, right? Like, what kind of therapy, what's the goal? I think it's just emphasizing kind of an accelerated pace that's not necessarily the thing we should be pushing when we're talking about how psychedelics can help people with various conditions. We shouldn't be pushing them because they're like so fast and because it's like very efficient. I think that that's going to bring people in with kind of the wrong mindset. Like, I can just rip this band-aid off and get through it really quickly. So I think mental health is really complicated. And so talking about it in that way, it worries me. Similarly, I also don't like sort of the pitting of psychedelics against SSRIs. I think that, as I said, mental health is really complicated, and having more tools at people's disposal, depending on their specific like risk benefit profile, also just like their desires, what they want, what kind of like lifestyle they have, having lots of different options is great. And so I've really been made uncomfortable by people within the psychedelics community being so vocally anti-SSRIs. And these are not perfect drugs, but they also help a lot of people, and they have benefits in certain contexts for certain people. So I think just like any sort of marketing that doesn't stress pluralism, or like talk about psychedelics as another tool and maybe a promising one in combination with other things, I sort of bristle at when I see that.
Yeah, actually, yeah, related to that. So that did remind me, the idea of curing depression, for example, is something that does bother me, because I mean, think of anything, what the research shows is that a lot of people do relapse after,
Yes.
After psilocybin therapy, and that in theory, potentially more, sessions could help, but that doesn't mean that they're going to be forever cured. That it might be the case that they might have to do 4 sessions a year or something like that. With ketamine, it was kind of a similar thing that happened, where it seemed like there's these really long lasting effects. And now I'm pretty sure like a very common, path for ketamine treatment is a couple times a week for the first, month. And then maybe you do cut down a little bit, but I think people are doing, it's not single doses with 2-month-long effects. It is funny. Yeah. That whole quote about the, X number of years of therapy, I do think there's a really interesting research question there, but we don't have the answer to that now. And I think, again, it is dangerous to phrase it in that particular way, but the idea of temporal dilation occurring under these drugs, maybe making things feel like things are further removed, they're further in the past, that people will say what time heals a broken heart or something along those lines. Right? So there is an interesting question there, but it's like, yeah, people are really jumping the gun on interpreting that, probably based on their own personal experience, that they had this temporal dilation experience, and now that they think that this is now going to apply to people with severe problems, when it's almost certainly not the case.
Yeah, the compressed timelines, and even just some of the language, like the word heal or cure, like is certainly concerning. I'm going to move on to the next topic, just because we're kind of flying through here. And this is more about companies in the industry. And, I have to keep reminding myself that you guys are in the United States and I'm here in Canada, because we've seen it shake out quite differently here. Like, for example, here in Canada, we've had some provinces introduce legislation regarding psychedelic assisted therapy, but they're really jumping the gun, because these compounds that they're pointing to are still in the criminal code. So therapists actually can't access them. Like, there's been some exemptions that are being made, but it still feels like some people are getting ahead of themselves here. So I'm curious how you would compare the industry, like various companies forming, some being listed on public stock exchanges, how the industry is forming around psychedelic assisted therapy versus governments. And we're probably going to be looking at state to state there. Some are introducing legislation when it comes to things like psilocybin. So yeah, basically comparing government versus industry, and how do you see the government introducing policy to actually move this ahead so that people can actually access this, both therapists and people who are looking for therapy?
I think it's really complicated. I don't know that much about Canada, but it's really complicated in the US, which I think also gets lost in translation a lot of the times when people are communicating about psychedelics, because similarly here, there's psychedelics are Schedule 1 drugs. I mean, ketamine is an approved anesthetic, but all the sort of classic psychedelics are Schedule 1. We have, psilocybin and MDMA going into phase 3 for FDA approval. But then you have a lot of companies that are forming kind of with no product yet, right? I mean, maybe they have like affiliate services, or they're investigating novel compounds. That's still pretty far away. And then on the side, you have state by state, either decriminalization or like legalized psilocybin services that might be available, but that's very limited. That's just Oregon and then maybe Colorado. But that hasn't even started yet. Oregon is just going to get started in January 2023. So there are all these access points, but none of them are really there yet. I mean, decriminalization is sort of the closest we've got. And once FDA approval happens, like for, let's say, Compass, correct me if I'm wrong, Manoj, but that just means that FDA will approve Compass's form of psilocybin, not psilocybin more generally. So we're still going to have all of this like really messy, confusing access in terms of what you can do legally, depending on which state you're in. Then there's still these rules, like you have to go to a person who has a license. So I think in terms of translation, sometimes when you read these news articles, it sounds like you're going to be able to go to your doctor tomorrow and do psilocybin therapy. Right now, really the only way to access that is if you go to Oregon, maybe in January, you do it in the underground, or you participate in a clinical trial.
Yeah, I was just talking to somebody about the procedure of legalizing, for example, MDMA. And I think that they were saying something similar, that if, MAPS gets this through, it'll be MAPS's MDMA that's legal, but not necessarily anybody else's, even if other people are making just as good MDMA that's, goes through all the checks, the toxicity checks and whatnot. So it does, end up in this weird area. And then you also have places like, Colorado, where they're legalizing or decriminalizing various natural psychedelics. And you've got things like ibogaine, I think, is one of the hallucinogens that's legal there, or that's decriminalized. And then LSD wasn't, which is a little odd to me when I don't think anybody should go home and try this, but I think there's been cases of people taking 100 times your standard dose of LSD, which would be probably about 100 mics. And so 100 times that. And I don't think they always die at all. Whereas I'm pretty sure if you take like 10 times the average trip of ibogaine, you are going into a dangerous zone there. And so, there's this weird thing happening where, some governments, local governments, are legalizing things, but I think they're kind of doing it wrong in some ways. And then the companies are probably the ones that are going to push this through legalization. As much as, we might all hate, big pharma and whatnot. It kind of took big pharma, unfortunately, to get ketamine through, right?
Yeah.
Even though it's, this weird form of it that has already been around. The enantiomer's already been around. Anybody can throw ketamine into a saline solution and blast it up their nose. And yet that's what, ended up getting approved, because, Johnson & Johnson had the money to push it through. And so I think it's unfortunate that, the companies are probably going to be the ones that get this through. And there is going to be some weird double standards of, only MAPS approved MDMA, or only, Compass approved psilocybin for a little bit. But I mean, hopefully it'll normalize, eventually.
But that intersection of government regulation and for-profit business can be bad, to nobody's surprise, because companies, what is their incentive to have other drugs that they don't own or profit from be legalized or decriminalized, right? Like they want their own to be accessible, but maybe not others. And we saw this very recently when the DEA attempted to schedule 5 novel tryptamines that were being researched. And there's an example of a company that advocated, just for their own molecule to not be scheduled, but not for the others. Whereas like the other people involved in bringing challenges to the DEA to not schedule those drugs because it would really make research more difficult. They said, this isn't my molecule, but none of these should be Schedule 1. Like, we're looking into these. Like, if it's Schedule 1, it's just all this red tape exists and we may not be able to continue researching it. So, we just had this example of seeing how, like, a company can advocate in policy settings that has to do with whatever it is they're working on. And I think that that's going to be an issue going forward as well, where people are just going to be advocating for their own interests, and then maybe it won't really make sense. Like Manoj said, like, was one of those tryptamines deserving of a Schedule 1 and the rest of them weren't, or like, are they all worthy of research? Like, that's a scientific question that sort of ended up pushed to the side in terms of the way people were advocating to the DEA about it.
Yeah, and then there's weird, I guess, like forces. Like, I know, Hamilton, for example, Hamilton Moores was painted as this, I don't know, money, hungry, whatever person. But he was actually somebody who was against field trip when they tried to only legalize their product. Or tried to only get their product not scheduled, sorry.
And Hamilton played a big role in, putting all together all of those submissions to the DEA about not scheduling those tryptamines. And they were successful, him and Matt Zorn and Graham Pachenik and, a couple other folks. So.
Right, which that benefits everybody, and those drugs can't, well, I guess maybe there's some way you can patent them, right? Maybe Compass is out there doing that and Hamilton actually had some ulterior motive, but I mean, really, at the end of the day, he actually, I think, helps everybody by doing that. So, I think there is this weird, forces between, corporate people and then, corporate pharma, and then people, who are not like that. And then people have to kind of play both sides. Like, I don't consider myself somebody who's totally against big pharma. And yes, I would probably be in if Compass came to me like they came to Hamilton, I would probably do something similar. But yeah.
Yeah, and you guys transitioned into my next question. Lovely. So you don't even need me here. But like it was about money, right? But I want to go back just a bit to about how this stuff is lobbied for to government agencies. And Manoj, like, you bring up Ibogaine, which is super interesting, because I remember a conversation I had with Mark Hayden, who I believe is still the executive director of MAPS Canada. And we were talking about LSD and the stigma surrounding LSD. And he's like, a lot of the clinical trials we're seeing are with psilocybin, because there's less stigma attached to it, partly because of, what he said, the 1960s and the New Age movement, but also just like the natural versus chemical idea. One is derived from a natural substance, the other is made in a lab. And I'm curious if you guys have thoughts on just, the stigma surrounding various psychedelics and how that might play out in terms of governments approving these for psychedelic assisted therapy.
So, I mean, I think the natural synthetic question is a very interesting one, because of course, chemically speaking, there's some debate around entourage effect from eating like the actual mushrooms, but the clinical trials that people talk about so enthusiastically were all done with synthetic psilocybin. So this question sort of breaks down if then you reference these studies in part of your petition for legalization, or to say that these drugs are going to be a good treatment option. Those were using synthetic. And in Oregon, I thought it was very interesting that they're not allowing synthetic psilocybin. You have to use the actual mushrooms. And there was a lot of discussion around that in the psilocybin advisory board. I listened to a lot of those meetings where some people were saying because synthetic psilocybin can be a liquid, if somebody has dysphagia, it could be a nice option if you can't sort of swallow something, and still they decided that it's natural only. So I think this is going to have to be something that we confront, because people who have ideas around natural synthetic, those ideas can make an impact too. Chemically, they are the same, but psychologically they could be different, and the ideas that people bring forward into exactly what the drugs mean and what meaning they have to them is relevant with psychedelics. We always kind of have to take those ideas into account. But in terms of petitioning the government or in terms of policy, psychedelics as an approved pharmacological drug will almost always be synthetic because it needs to have good manufacturing practice. I think at least in the immediate future, like this is something called GMP. You need to be able to say, like, I know what the dose is, I know how it was made, I know how it was made safely. That's why synthetic is used. So maybe in the future there might be some alternative, but in terms of FDA approval, I feel like it's going to be synthetic, at least in the immediate future.
Yeah, and even if it were like taken from the mushroom, it's probably going to be, or from something. I think there's bacteria out there too that can synthesize it. That it's going to be, it's going to be isolated. It's going to be relatively pure. There's going to be a negligible amount of anything else in there. And so, an example of where I think that is done is, I think, Epidiolex. It's CBD. It's, CBD is mostly garbage, right? It does seem to work for certain types of epilepsy. And at very high doses that might even damage your liver. And that I think that is actually isolated from cannabis. I could be wrong on that, but there is, so there's times when they can do that because it is cheaper to do so. But I mean, I think psilocybin at this point is probably easy. Like it's easier to synthesize, I think, than cannabinoids, at least cannabinoids that, look like THC, CBD, et cetera. And so I'm assuming that they're probably not going to do that, but I'm not a chemist, so I don't want to say never. But yeah, I think the whole debate of natural and and synthetic is I don't know how to say this. I think it's stupid. And so I think it's like, all right, if you're only going to take natural stuff, then go ahead and take that poison dart frog, or go ahead and take the, straight from the bacteria, penicillin or whatever it is. And, good luck with that. I think that, again, Ibogaine, I'm going to say, is more dangerous than, LSD. Or, if you're not going to take, if you're all pro, natural, then take ergot. That'll see how that goes for you. That's naturally occurring LSD, basically, like, right? I'm kidding. Don't do that. That'll probably kill you. But yeah, I think that it's not good. And I think this Ibogaine thing is a perfect example. I'm not saying that Ibogaine shouldn't be approved. Chances are there's probably going to be a better version of Ibogaine out there that's going to be synthesized eventually, that doesn't have all the dangers and doesn't have Ibogaine has a bunch of effects that are potentially unnecessary. We don't know which ones are necessary, if it's the kappa opioid agonism, if it's the weak amount of serotonin 2A agonism, if that's even part of it. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm pro decriminalizing drugs and, have, people safely getting all the information they need and taking drugs and whatever, whether it's for medical purposes or something else. But yeah, I think that, by having this natural versus synthetic debate, it ends up being, it ignores what the science has to say. And yeah, I then you end up getting, these, again, these bad policies like, oh, Ibogaine's now, legal, but LSD isn't. So, yeah.
Something I think is funny is sometimes when you're out in the world, you hear people talk about plant medicine, and then like in the next sentence, they talk about MAPS, which is using MDMA. Like, I think we're just, I think it's like, I kind of agree with you. Like, if you're really hell-bent against synthetics as like medicine, or even like to be researched or to be broadly available as treatment, to just kind of like ask yourself why that is. Again, I think that there's a lot more just like belief that comes into that than there is data or evidence that natural is definitely better than synthetic.
Yeah, LSD always gets the pass amongst those people too, and I don't know why that is. And they're like, oh, it's semi-synthetic, whatever that means. It's like it's not naturally occurring, bro. Come on,
Yeah. And like everybody has so much support of MAPS, and MAPS is operating, purely with MDMA, which is a synthetic molecule too. So I think it's just, I agree with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Alexander Shulgin and others have created 500 plus psychedelics out there. There's no way in hell Mother Nature got it correct with psilocybin. There's going to be a better one out there. Yeah.
A lot of great points. And it does seem to be a bit of a false dichotomy, but I guess we'll have to see how it shakes out. I don't see anyone advocating for, licking toads or eating fungus in caves just yet, but I guess we'll have to see.
But I guess, again, it's one of these things where, I think it's absurd to some degree, but it again, kind of, it's like the cannabis thing. It's like a Trojan horse to get things, passed. And, if it takes natural psychedelics to eventually get all of them decriminalized, as well as opioids and all drugs decriminalized, then whatever.
Yeah. And, I want to touch upon the point about profit and incentive, because you guys kind of touched upon it, so you don't need to go ad nauseum. But the question I wrote was, do you have concerns that products are being pushed for profit without adequate evidence-based proof of their efficacy? And we've kind of circled around this topic a few times already, but just wondering if there's anything you would raise in terms of concerns, specifically around money, profit, incentive.
I mean, I think we should always be wary of what people are promising to people who are going to be consumers when they want to make money. I mean, that's just like capitalism, baby. Like, it's just like a thing that we have to be wary of. And it doesn't mean that the data is not exciting and promising and that these things might not help a lot of people. But right now we have kind of like an imbalance of profit, like for-profit entities versus like the first government research grant in like 50 years was just given last year to Johns Hopkins for psilocybin for smoking cessation. We've had this sort of like empty vacuum of public funding and research where, of course, there's like motives within academia and like within nonprofits as well. Nobody's hands are completely clean, but usually there's like a more mixed ecosystem. And so I think that's one of the reasons that we have to be careful and just like paying attention to what people are promising. And I think the role of journalists is also to, like, when a study comes out that people are really using to advertise a product, to connect the dots and really try to explain to people what the studies really show and what stage they're at, so that people don't just come running in and ready to just like put their lives and all their money on the line for something that is promising, but we need to understand the limits of it. And I think there's like I think there's a pretty strong ethical like consideration here. There's a philosopher of psychiatry that I like a lot named Jake Jackson, and he talks about how one of the difficulties of being a person with mental illness is that you are epistemically adrift. This is his word that he comes up with, where it's like, epistemics is the study of knowledge. People are telling you so many things that they know will work for you. Like, I know that this is going to cure your depression. No, this is going to cure your depression. So not only do you have the distress that you're dealing with from whatever your condition is, then you also have this pressure put on you to go out and sort of navigate and make decisions in the marketplace, or just even about how you identify with your distress, what it is that's going to help you. And that, just on top of everything else, is like so difficult. I'm sure anybody who's even just tried to like find a therapist understands what it means to be epistemically adrift and like trying to like, should I do CBT or analysis, all those things. So I think that's why we have to be wary of what people are promising, and for better or for worse, like, profit is directly tied to that, because these companies want to survive, and the way our finance model works is they want to give money back to their investors, and there's a lot of pressure on them to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think right now what people are I guess there's definitely some kooky advertisements out there. I think we all know that one from Australia. It was pretty weird, maybe promising too much in song form. But I think that, yeah, I think right now a lot of the companies I don't feel like they're necessarily maybe some of their CEOs are the ones who are being kind of bad, but the companies themselves are not necessarily, I think, promising too much. They're saying, hey, look, psilocybin, we have some results. It seems to work. All these other studies are showing it does as well. Same thing with MDMA. My guess is those effects are going to get smaller, but they're not going to go away. So I don't know if they're doing anything dishonest by saying that, hey, I think we've got something new here for certain disorders. But yeah, I think that, I do think that there's going to be better drugs out there that'll be probably safer. Whether or not they're going to be that much better for different conditions, I'm less certain of that. I don't, but I think that, yeah, there will eventually be drugs out there that'll probably be safer. And I think that's something that people will probably start marketing. So I think, I don't know, and there might be some other things out there too. I think that people who are looking into different ways of modulating, for example, the serotonin 2A receptor, whether that's with antagonists or agonists, or something else, I think that there are going to be some new tools out there that I don't know if they'll necessarily be better, but people are probably going to market it in a way that is better. And I guess we'll just have to see, I guess, if they really are. But as far as just marketing psilocybin and MDMA, I don't know if it's a stretch to have to say, hey, look, we might have some new treatments for depression and PTSD.
Yeah, and I think that's the key, like how it's presented, right? Like to me, it feels like vaguely dystopian to think of a company being like, we have the solution to all of your life's problems, and all you have to do is take this capsule. Like and so I haven't really seen that, but I guess
I mean, people are already doing that with SSRIs. So
exactly. I mean, it's like what we said before, like this, maybe psychedelics aren't there yet, but I think we know enough from the way that past mental health interventions are talked about that we should be prepared for that kind of language, the single fix, because it's much nicer to say that than to say like, mental health is so complicated and like everything we try like only works on 50% of people, and maybe that's because mental illness is a really complex interaction between like a person and their environment, like then that doesn't sound very nice and it doesn't fit on a poster because it goes on too long. So yeah, I agree with you that we shouldn't be too like, it is a potential new treatment for depression or PTSD. Like I think we can be really honest about that. I think that's fine. We can even be excited about it and like be excited that maybe it can work for some people. I also think that it's like companies aren't bad for making profits. Sort of like the point of a company. Like the reason that companies make profits is that so they can do the work that they're doing. I mean, I think that that's good too. I'm not anti for-profit companies. I'm not even anti-patent, despite what some people may feel about me. So I think all of these things just have to be kind of like contextualized in terms of, how does the profit impact the way the company talks about things, or how does it impact like their decision making, what they choose to patent, how we understand like the patent system more generally, and whether there are like blind spots specifically with psychedelics that are allowing bad patents through, all of that stuff. So it's just it all is very complicated, and there's no like easy good guys, bad guys.
Yeah, whenever I think of pharmaceutical commercials, the list of side effects is always either the most amusing or depressing part. And wouldn't it be great like if those long list of side effects were all positive things? Like, side effects may include greater appreciation of life, closer relationships with your loved ones. Which brings me to analogs. So, we talked a bit about how, sort of novel versions of various compounds are being marketed. And I want to ask you guys, what your thoughts are on analogs in terms of like, for example, one that I've seen from a company here in Canada was a version of psilocybin with a much shorter duration. So they're saying this will essentially last 4 hours versus 6 to 8. And the idea being, it's much more practical for use in a clinic. So you don't have to tie up, an entire day of a therapist's time and the space for it as well. So curious on your thoughts on analogs and if they might actually be more effective than the so-called classical psychedelics.
I'll let you start first on this.
I was going to let you start because you've written about this, right?
Well, yes. I did write an article about this, which I interviewed Manoj for, though, for his thoughts.
So I guess, yeah, I mean, I've sort of already started talking about it. I think that's the type of thing that I think could be useful. I'm still like, people talk about the qualitative differences between various different drugs and, DMT versus psilocybin, for example. And I'm not totally convinced that some of those drugs, the differences matter too much. I think probably something like 2CB, which tends to be a very, visual drug with a little bit, not as much of the weird headspace, at least at doses that you get visuals from, that might be less useful potentially. For example, 5-MeO-DMT seems like a qualitatively very different drug. The whiteout experience people get. It also seems to be a little bit more dangerous. But yeah, I mean, as far as getting, I think that type of thing where you're shortening the drug's effect and getting like a nice window, I think will be probably something that will be useful, rather than some of these, smaller qualitative differences. Like getting a drug that has, that can hit pretty quickly and only lasts a couple hours would probably be a pretty useful drug if someone can create that. I think the easy way to do that would be a slow release serotonin 2A antagonist, but somebody can steal that idea from me, please. And so, I mean, people are already actually kind of doing something like that. I think they've already got the idea of trying to use an antagonist with psilocybin just to get rid of the psychoactive effects. And my guess is, if they haven't already, that group in Basel, if they haven't already, because they've patented a lot of things, it wouldn't surprise me if they've tried to patent administering a serotonin 2A antagonist with LSD. That way you don't have to trip for 10 hours. So yeah, I mean, I think the analogs, it's an interesting place to be in. Again, I'm a little skeptical that small qualitative differences between some of these drugs are going to make that big of a difference. Safety is going to be important. The duration is going to be important. Being able to turn off the trip is going to be important. But yeah, whether, and maybe the David Olson stuff, is an interesting idea. I don't know if they're totally non-psychoactive. We don't know that yet because, as far as I know, no one in his lab has taken those drugs. And so, but it might be the case that that's like a new class of, antidepressant SSRI, where it's, you take it over multiple days, and then you get something, after a month of taking it, maybe then it leads to some beneficial effects. But yeah, I mean, I guess, I don't know. We'll see. I think, honestly, I think probably what's going to be maybe more important, I could be wrong on this, I could be totally wrong. Here's my prediction, is what people do during the trip might end up being a more important thing to be studying. So, whether or not people should be, doing certain types of psychotherapy, or they should just be laying on a couch listening to white people music with eye shades on, or, maybe the electronic kids were right and electronic music is where it's at when you're, under the effects of these drugs. I don't know, but I think that might be I don't know, I think I'm a little biased because I'm a psychologist, an experimental psychologist by training, and that's where, my field is kind of at. But I think that might be more important than, the specific drug, as long as it's, hallucinogenic and puts people into a weird headspace, and perhaps serotonin 2A agonist, et cetera.
Yeah, I tend to agree, or at least I think that there should be an equal amount of attention placed on manipulating therapeutic factors and the experience as these, like, all of the emphasis that's being placed on, like, can we make it 2 hours, 3 hours, 1.5 hours, 2.75 hours, like all of the minute modifications that are being attempted with the analog drugs. In terms of access, I mean, I have felt conflicted about the non-psychedelic psychedelics, or like the shorter duration, not because I don't think it's an interesting research question, I think it is, but to me it sort of makes me confront like harsh realities about the mental health care system in the US, which is just that, like, it sucks. And people getting time with therapists, like a long time with therapists, having the therapy covered by insurance is really, really difficult. And so if a non-psychedelic, non-hallucinogenic psychedelic is developed, that's what's going to be used and prioritized, just because of the realities of, like, therapy hours and who's going to pay for it. But that sort of leaves out the question of, like, is that most efficacious? Like, is that what most people would want to do, versus having the longer experience, the 6-hour experience, the 7-hour experience, whatever it may be? Some people may not want that, and they want the shorter one, or they have cluster headaches and they're like, I don't want to trip, I just want my headaches to go away. But like, I feel like patient autonomy in the kind of experience that they want, and then, that's paired with like the kind of therapeutic experience they want, is something that I really value. And so then I just sometimes worry, and again, this is separate from whether or not it's an interesting research question, we don't really know what the qualitative experience is like of these drugs yet, but like that they're just going to be prioritized, A, because they're patentable, and then B, just because they're cheaper to administer clinically, which would be a shame if that was guiding the decision making, rather than like what people wanted, or like what really led to best outcomes.
Mhm.
Yeah, so I think Shayla brings up a couple of points. I think that there probably will be a sweet spot in terms of the duration of drug action, that something like, 15 minutes is probably too short, maybe 2 hours is perfect. in terms of at least what we can do in the actual clinics, and then the actual benefit to the individual. I think that there's, there was some data that, Gould Dolan had been presenting showing that the duration of action seemed to be related to at least some of the opening of the critical windows that she's been showing. So, for example, Ibogaine, I think, had a very large or had a longer duration of action in terms of some of the behaviors she was looking at, because Ibogaine lasts a really long time. Ketamine had the shortest one because it's only, 30 minutes or whatever, which then makes me think it's like, oh, if we're going to go with that class of drugs, the NMD antagonist, maybe we should be going for PCP because it does last longer.
Yeah.
So, there might be something there, but I think that Shayla also brings up this point that, especially when we're talking about humans, you're not talking about these very specific behaviors in animals. You're talking about, their whole life story, that spending more time with a therapist or just people who care about you is probably important. Like, we don't do any super directed psychotherapy here, at Hopkins. It's just a lot of spending time with people. And, at least the people who, buy into the, warm, I mean, I like to joke that my lab's a spa, spa type environment. They do seem to, a lot of that does contribute, to their benefit. And, as much as I like to give grief to all the hippie stuff, like, I think that that's sometimes what people want and need. And they can just, have a lot more of that if there's a longer duration of drug effect. And there is a preparation, which, the preparation is just people just, talking to you and listening to you, right? And then same thing with the integration. It's just, people listening to whatever you went through. So, yeah, I think that it does end up, you can imagine it by prioritizing if they are non-psychoactive, the potentially safer ones, right? That they might not work as well just because there's not going to be as much of this, psychotherapy happening, or just spending time with people, forget even psychotherapy, just spending time with warm people, which I think a lot of people, especially with various disorders, they start to, they don't have as much of that anymore, especially with novel people that, that aren't, people in their circle or whatever. And so, yeah, I think that's kind of an interesting thing about these analogs and the non-psychoactives, but I don't know, we'll just have to see. Maybe there really will be a pill you can take and it really does make you a lot better without much psychotherapy, but I somehow doubt it.
Yeah. This is where I raise the disclaimer that we're getting to the end. So if anyone has questions for either Shayla or Manoj, now is your time for Forever Hold Your Peace. You can just throw them in the chat, or honestly, if people can just, I don't know if they can just turn their mic on and talk, but whatever works. If there are no questions, my last question for you guys was essentially, what kind of advice would you provide to people who are marketing this stuff, like to do so responsibly? And I think perhaps like Shayla, I'm really curious what you would suggest to journalists who are writing about this stuff, because, as journalists, as a conduit to the public. And Manoj, I guess for you, it would be like how experts speak about this stuff to journalists, because, that can be complex too. So, what kind of steps would you guys suggest in terms of how to present this stuff responsibly and accurately?
Yeah, I mean, there's several things. I'll just blow through them quickly. I think one is emphasizing uncertainty and not having that necessarily be a bad thing, but having it be something that's interesting. I mean, to me, when I write about uncertainty in science, it's not like, oh, we don't know everything. It's like, hey, we don't know everything, and that this is like the point of what we're doing here, is that we're learning about it. And as I've said a bunch of times, I think it's unethical to promise people certainty when it comes to mental health, because it construes mental health issues as something singular and discrete, which I don't think that they are. So I think that the psychedelics community could do a lot better job at not going the SSRI route and acting as if there is a single solution to something even like depression. I mean, I would love to see more recognition that's happening in other mental health spaces of things like, like the psychosocial influences, things like the social disability model of mental health, or even things like neurodiversity. Like there are these conversations that are trying to make our discussion around mental illness more rich that are happening elsewhere in psychiatry. And I think psychedelics could do a good job in incorporating some of that into the way that we talk about what these substances are for and what they might do for people. And just brief, I'll just add one last thing is just like in terms of like decrim and legalization, I think that we should all take like a big step back from psychedelic exceptionalism, which is that if you care about the decriminalization of psychedelics or the legalization of psychedelics, like you have to extend that to include all drugs, because there are reasons to decriminalize and legalize drugs that have nothing to do with like how beneficial you think they are. This is just a harm reduction strategy that we have really good data on that like saves people's lives. So excluding other drugs from your advocacy is something I think psychedelics should also not do in terms of just the way that we talk about them.
Yeah, so I think actually, yeah, this is, I think, something that, Shayla was kind of getting at. I think there's certain aspects in which I think the psychedelic movement is doing things right, like the psychotherapy component, just having a lot of spending time with people, and that because it is a fresh field, that maybe they can incorporate some of these other, psychosocial things happening. But yeah, I mean, as far as just like reporting and trying to get things accurate goes, and I think Shayla, first of all, does a really good job of doing that. I know that when there was that whole fiasco about the Nature of Medicine paper, she really wanted to make sure she was getting things right. And I know that there was a lot of emails between Shayla, myself, and Phil Corlett to make sure that she had a good explanation of some of the statistics. And she was very humble about it, and didn't act like she knew everything. And it turns out she, I think, did a really amazing job explaining what went on in that paper, such that I think that a lot of the people that had seen my name that had popped up randomly in certain media places, they were able to talk to me about it and understand what happened there. So I don't know. Yeah, I think that that's something is just not, I think scientists also, we tend to like, I'm not the best person. I'm glad Phil was there to explain things, because I'm not the best person, I think, at explaining difficult concepts sometimes. And so I think getting multiple opinions, getting multiple takes, I think also, just getting multiple takes. I think this is kind of where maybe Michael Pollan went wrong, and he decided to push the default mode network narrative because he interviewed one neuroscientist, or one person who uses tools from neuroscience anyways. And yeah, it was like there was all these other people who didn't get probably as much of a chance to say, this is, yeah, lots of drugs impact the default mode network. It's not even the network that, it takes the largest hit in terms of, psychedelic drug action, et cetera. And now even the person who's pushed that default mode network narrative has said there's been an overemphasis on the default mode network narrative. So yeah, I think getting multiple takes is important. Like trying to get the adversarial takes is important, even though it does make your job more complicated, I'm sure. It is probably going to be far more useful for accurately putting information out there. And I mean, frankly, as far as probably from a, as far as journalism goes, it probably makes things a little bit more interesting for the reader, where it's like, hey, look, here's two people who don't agree with each other. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe sometimes it's nice to just have a neat story that fits perfectly, like your default mode network is your ego, right? But I think sometimes having, the controversy, I think is, I don't know, I find that interesting whenever that's why I like Twitter, or I used to like Twitter anyways. When seeing different scientists kind of disagree with each other it was amazing to see that like on there. So yeah, I think that's yeah, what I would say about that.
Where are the adversarial collaborations in psychedelics? I like in an article, it's super interesting when people have different viewpoints, not about something like climate change, but like, something we actually don't know about. But in science, you can do adversarial collaborations where you get two people who really disagree with each other and they do a paper together. I would love to see that in psychedelics.
So we're kind of doing that. There's this thing known as the BOLD Psychedelic Consortium. It's BOLD means the blood oxygen level dependent signal. It's what we measure with fMRI. And a bunch of us are putting all of our data together, and we're going to pre-process it similarly. A lot of people might not realize this, but there's a lot of seemingly arbitrary steps that people take before you get to a time series of data that you can do something with. Like, let's say this time series represents a brain area's activity. There's a lot that can be done. And so we're trying to all similarly pre-process our data. And then the plan is to eventually upload it, and anybody can look at those data and do whatever they want to it. But yeah, it's kind of interesting. There's already been some like disagreement, like everything from the pre-processing steps to the some of the analyses, to the emphasis. Again, believe it or not, there's some other people in this collaboration that are really pro the default mode network, not the people you would expect, by the way. And so I don't want to throw any names or give off anything too early, because it's still it's been going on for a year, but it's been taking a minute to get everything together. But yeah, I think that there is a little bit, there is hopefully going to be more of that. I think that actually with those data, we had an idea of kind of testing different circuit models. That was something that we were interested in doing with something like that. But yeah, I mean, I think the problem is that some of these, models that people are coming up with, they're somewhat unfalsifiable. And so it becomes difficult to, do that kind of adversarial collaboration unless you have something that can be falsified. So I don't know, we'll see. I mean, I'm sure as things develop, there will be more falsifiable models, and then people will do more of these adversarial collaborations. But yeah.
Yeah. I think you guys raised great points about highlighting those gaps in knowledge too, right? Because that can actually be a way to bring people into a topic. I think often we as journalists are very focused on like, what is certain, what is the news? People want to know what's new. They want to learn what we know, but highlighting what we don't know can in a lot of ways be just as interesting, and especially if there's a bit of disagreement, if there's a bit of tension. So yeah, I think you guys raised great points. And essentially my big takeaway is to read all of Shayla's stuff and to speak to Manoj as much as I can, because you guys will not steer us wrong.
Or maybe we will, in which case you should also not trust us. Get multiple sources.
Yeah,
again,
exactly. Always fact check.
Healthily skeptical. And I think you guys both presented an equal amount of excitement and caution. So very balanced discussion today. That's all from me. I've got to get back to writing things. We did not get any questions. I'm a bit sad about that, but it just means you guys were that good. Or maybe my questions were that good. But regardless, I think this was really fascinating. I learned a lot. And yeah, I just appreciate hearing from you guys. And thanks to everyone who joined us for balancing excitement and caution in the public eye for psychedelics.
Thanks, Omar.
Thanks,
everyone. Yep.